Welcome to my channel.
It was a Tuesday in Lochdub, a day remarkable only for the unrelenting grey drizzle that seemed to dissolve the distinction between the sky and the sea. Inside the police station, a structure that had once served as a crofter's cottage, PC Hamish Macbeth sat with his long, thin legs stretched toward the comforting peat fire. Lugs, his orange, rough-haired mongrel of indeterminate breed, lay on his back with all four paws in the air, occasionally snoring in a way that suggested a busy life of leisure. The phone rang. It possessed a strident, persistent tone that Hamish had long learned to ignore. It was undoubtedly the headquarters in Strathbane, wanting to know about some missing garden ornaments in Bonar Bridge, or suggesting he attend a refresher course on health and safety in the workplace. Hamish continued to nurse his mug of muddy coffee, gazing out the window. Outsiders Sassenachs mostly often mistook Hamish for being simple, or at the very least, professionally incompetent. His red hair, which usually defied the grip of a comb, his lanky frame, and his slow Highland drawl all contributed to the illusion. In truth, Hamish was naturally clever, a trait he kept carefully hidden. If people knew he was efficient, they might promote him, and if he were promoted, he would be moved away from Lochdub to a grey city filled with crime and smog. Hamish Macbeth had designed his life to avoid such a catastrophe. Today, however, the need for coffee was being usurped by the empty feeling in his stomach. The cupboard contained only a stale biscuit and a half-empty bag of dried pet food. He looked at Lugs. "I believe, Lugs, that the time has come for a small act of poaching." He donned his waterproofs, grabbed a sturdy rod, and exited through the back door, carefully avoiding any sight of the main street where Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, might spy him and demand he fill out some arrears forms. He made his way to a secluded bend in the river that fed into the loch, where the water swirled darkly beneath overhanging rowan trees. Within 20 minutes, through skill and a disregard for riparian laws, he had landed a plump, silvery salmon. He hid it in the bottom of a sack, covered it with some nettles, and was heading back toward the village when a low, sleek red sports car roared past him, splashing a wave of muddy water up his legs. The car, an Italian thing with far too much horsepower for the single-track roads of Sutherland, screeched to a halt in front of the Lochdub Hotel. Out stepped a man who screamed city money and 0 cents. He wore a stark, white linen jacket, entirely unsuitable for the Scottish weather, and gold-rimmed sunglasses despite the drizzle. His name was Julian Vane. Hamish knew this because the entire village had been discussing little else for 2 weeks. Vane, a retired investment banker from London, had bought the Old Manse, an imposing grey stone house overlooking the harbour. He had immediately set about alienating the locals by demanding a better sewage system, which would have meant digging up the only car park, complaining about the noise of the fishing boats at 3 a.m, and referring to the village as quaint but primitive. "You!" Vane shouted, spotting Hamish. He waved a manicured hand in a condescending manner that made Hamish want to throw the salmon at him. Hamish walked over slowly, his expression a masterpiece of blank cooperation. "Aye, sir. Is there something I can do for you?" Vane gestured toward his car. "Someone has scratched the bumper of my Ferrari. I demand an immediate investigation. It's vandalism. High-tech forensics might be required. The perpetrator surely left a thumbprint. A scratch, is it?" Hamish drawled, peering at the car with an expression of deep, feigned confusion. "In Lochdub, sir, we usually find that scratches come from the heather brushing against them when the road is narrow." "It's vandalism," Vane snapped, his voice high and irritated, carrying perfectly to Mrs. Kennedy, who was currently peering through the window of the post office with her nose flattened against the glass. "You people have a resentment against wealth. I see how you look at my car." "It's a very fine car, sir," Hamish said soothingly, not for a moment taking his eyes off the man's face. He was noting the tightness around the eyes, the way the man kept glancing toward the hotel, and the slight tremor in his hand. Julian Vane wasn't just arrogant, he was frightened of something. "Well, look into it. Though I must say, without the sophisticated machinery they have in Glasgow, it might just be a case of bad luck." Vane scoffed. "Typical. Incompetent. Lazy Highlanders. I'll make sure your superiors hear about this." He spun on his heel, leaving his Ferrari parked illegally diagonally across the hotel entrance, and stalked toward the bar, presumably to order an expensive single malt and complain about the lack of signal for his stocks app. Hamish watched him go, a thin smile playing on his lips. "I don't think Mr. Vane will be staying long in Lochdub," he said to himself. "The village does not agree with him, and I don't believe he agrees with the village." Little did he know, Hamish was correct, though the reason for Vane's departure would be far more permanent and messy than any of them had anticipated. Hamish slipped back into the police station through the rear door, evading the sharp gaze of Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, who was marching down the street. Once inside the sanctuary of his kitchen, he swiftly dealt with the poached salmon. The skies outside had cleared beautifully, leaving a crisp, biting frost that turned the village of Lochstub into a glittering, pristine postcard. It was the kind of morning that made a man glad to be alive, provided he was beside a roaring stove with fresh fish and hot tea. Luggs sat at his feet, thumping his tail rhythmically against the linoleum, thoroughly approving of this turn of events. Hamish had just settled into his armchair, a forkful of perfectly flaky salmon halfway to his mouth, when the heavy brass knocker on the front door clattered with an urgency that set his teeth on edge. He sighed deeply, lowering his fork. The universe, it seemed, was entirely opposed to a Highland policeman enjoying a quiet, well-earned breakfast. He shuffled to the door in his stocking feet, pulling it open to reveal a breathless, red-faced Willie Lamont. The local baker's assistant was trembling so violently that the flour dusting his apron puffed into the frosty air like small clouds of smoke. "Hamish!" Willie gasped, clutching the doorframe. "It's terrible, just awful. Down by the old harbour wall. You've got to come right now." "Take a breath, Willie," Hamish said mildly, though a cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. His beautiful, lazy morning was disintegrating before his eyes. "What exactly is terrible?" "It's the wealthy Sassenach," Willie stammered, his eyes wide with shock. "The one with the fancy red car. He's dead, Hamish, hung up like a prize catch." Hamish closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second. A murder. In Lochstub. The paperwork alone would be a nightmare, but worse, it meant the terrifying prospect of DCI Blair descending upon the village from Strathbane, bringing with him a storm of insults, incompetence, and unearned authority. "Right," Hamish muttered, abandoning the thought of his cooling salmon. "Let me get my boots." 5 minutes later, Hamish and Luggs were crunching across the frost-hardened grass toward the ancient stone structure of the harbour wall. The sea was glass-still under the piercingly blue sky, a stark contrast to the grim scene awaiting them. A small cluster of villagers had already gathered, whispering furiously amongst themselves, but they parted silently as the tall, lanky policeman approached. Hamish stopped at the edge of the seawall and peered down. It was, indeed, a bizarre and thoroughly humiliating way to depart the world. Arrogant London newcomer Marcus Thorne was suspended upside down. A heavy-duty fishing net had been hoisted up one of the old rusted loading cranes, tangling the man completely. His stark white linen jacket was ruined, stained with seawater, mud, and something darker that had pooled beneath his head on the jagged rocks. His expensive sunglasses were floating gently in a nearby tidal pool. "Stand back, all of you," Hamish ordered, his voice suddenly losing his lazy drawl and taking on a sharp edge of authority. "I don't want anyone trampling over the pebbles. Willie, go back to the station and ring headquarters. Tell them we have a suspicious death." As the crowd shuffled backward, Hamish climbed down the slippery stone steps to the rocky beach. Luggs followed, sniffing the air cautiously before sitting down a respectful distance from the body. Hamish crouched beside the tangled net. The man's face was purple, his expression frozen in a mask of sheer terror. Hamish shoved his hands deep into his pockets, his sharp blue eyes scanning the surrounding rocks. The crane's winch was locked into place, meaning someone with considerable strength had hoisted the man up. More interestingly, one of the man's expensive Italian loafers was missing, nowhere to be seen among the kelp and rocks. Why take a shoe? It was a petty, strange detail that didn't fit the brutal nature of the crime. Hamish sighed, the cold air biting his nose. He knew exactly what would happen next. Headquarters would send Blair, who would stomp around roaring about robbery or a mugging gone wrong, entirely missing the subtle, strange undercurrents of Lochstub. Hamish reached out gently and touched the frayed edge of the fishing net. It was local twine, tied with a very specific, complicated knot used only by the older generation of Sutherland fishermen. The arrogant outsider hadn't just been killed, he had been made an example of. The peaceful facade of the village had been ripped away. Hamish stood up, gazing out over the frozen loch, waiting for the sirens. The piercing wail of police sirens shattered the pristine, frosty silence of the loch long before the vehicles came into view. Hamish Macbeth leaned against the cold iron of the crane, pulling his uniform collar up against the biting chill. Beside him, Luggs let out a low, mournful whine, clearly offended by the mechanical noise ruining their peaceful morning. 2 heavy patrol cars and a larger, unmarked van came skidding down the icy, narrow road toward the harbour, tyres crunching aggressively over the frozen gravel. The doors flew open, and out spilled the Strathbane Criminal Investigation Department, a chaotic flurry of dark coats and loud voices that immediately banished any remaining Highland tranquility. Leading the charge was Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose permanent state of rage was matched only by his profound lack of investigative skill. Blair possessed a face like a boiled ham, round and perpetually red, topping a barrel-like torso squeezed into an ill-fitting trench coat. He stomped across the frosted pebbles, his heavy brogue slipping dangerously on the seaweed, though he managed to right himself with a string of colourful curses. Close on his heels were his two faithful shadows, Detectives Jimmy Anderson and Harry Macnab, both looking miserable and hungover in the biting cold. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls of the harbour. "What in the name of all that is holy is this circus? And why is that mangy carpet you call a dog anywhere near my crime scene?" "Morning, sir," Hamish drawled, his voice impossibly slow and devoid of any intellectual spark. He tipped his peaked cap slightly, adopting the vacant expression of a man who found shoelaces a mental challenge. "It's Mr. Thorne, sir. The new guy at the old manse. It seems he's met with a bit of an accident with the fishing nets." Blair stopped dead, staring at the hanging, frozen corpse. For a moment, even the blustering DCI was silenced by the sheer absurdity of the sight. Thorne hung there like an overgrown mackerel, his ruined white linen jacket stiff with frost. Then, Blair's face darkened to an even deeper shade of magenta. "An accident? You gormless idiot! Do men accidentally hoist themselves into the air with heavy machinery? This is murder, you useless Highland peasant. A brutal, calculated murder, and you're standing around doing nothing as usual." Hamish blinked mildly, offering a serene nod. "Aye, sir." "I had a feeling it might be that. I was just keeping an eye on him until you arrived to figure out the hard parts." "Get out of my way!" Blair snapped, shoving past Hamish and nearly slipping on a patch of black ice. He peered at the body, his eyes darting quickly over the scene without actually observing anything of value. He completely ignored the complicated local knot securing the net to the winch, and he failed entirely to notice the glaring absence of the victim's left shoe. "It's obvious what happened here," Blair declared loudly, turning to Anderson and Macnab. "A robbery gone wrong. This Thorne fellow was flashing his London cash around, came down here for a midnight stroll, and some local thug jumped him for his wallet, hoisted him up to search his pockets properly. He's still got his gold watch on his wrist, sir," Hamish pointed out softly, gesturing toward the rigid arm dangling from the netting. "And I believe his wallet is bulging in his breast pocket. Seems a terrible lazy robber, if you ask me." Blair whirled around, glaring at the lanky constable. "Nobody asked you, Macbeth. What do you know about the criminal mind? You spend your days chasing stray sheep and gossiping with old women." The attacker was clearly interrupted before he could take the valuables, fled the scene in a panic. Blair pointed a thick, accusatory finger toward the small crowd of villagers still hovering near the seawall. "And it'll be one of these backward locals. Bring me that old fool, Angus MacDonald. I know for a fact he uses these nets. He's probably been nursing a grudge because this Londoner complained about the smell of fish." Hamish sighed internally, his stomach giving a loud, complaining rumble. Angus MacDonald was 82 years old, crippled with arthritis, and barely had the strength to lift a pint of heavy, let alone winch a grown man into the air. But arguing with Blair was like trying to teach algebra to a turnip. It was frustrating, pointless, and only made everyone angry. "Right away, sir," Hamish said smoothly, taking a deliberate step back from the investigation. "I'll just go and fetch old Angus for you. Shall I organise some hot tea while your men secure the perimeter?" "Just fetch the suspect and stay out of our way, Macbeth," Blair growled, already shouting orders at his miserable detectives to fetch a ladder. Hamish whistled sharply to Lugs, turning his back on the blustering DCI. As he walked away, his mind was racing, neatly categorising the missing shoe, the specialised knot, and the specific location of the murder. The real investigation was about to begin, and Hamish Macbeth intended to conduct it entirely from the comfortable corner of the village to room. Hamish strolled away from the harbour at a pace that suggested he had all the time in the world, his hands buried deep in his heavy tunic pockets. Behind him, the shouts of DCI Blair echoed off the icy stones, demanding a ladder that was entirely too short for the rusted crane. Lugs trotted faithfully at his master's heels, occasionally stopping to sniff a frost-rimed clump of heather before sneezing loudly in the crisp air. The atmosphere was sharp and clean, carrying the faint, briny scent of the loch mixed with the irresistible, sweet aroma of baking bread wafting from the high street. Hamish let his complaining stomach guide him directly toward the source. The brass bell above the door of the village bakery chimed a cheerful welcome as Hamish pushed it open, stepping out of the biting cold and into a cloud of flowery warmth. The small shop was already buzzing with the morning's frantic gossip. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, had seemingly abandoned her official duties entirely to lean across the glass counter, deep in conversation with Mrs. Wellington, the minister's formidable wife. Willie Lamont was hovering nervously by the ovens, looking paler than usual. "Morning, ladies," Hamish drawled softly, removing his peaked cap and shaking a stray flake of frost from his fiery red hair. He ambled over to the counter, his eyes fixed longingly on a tray of freshly baked, glistening fruit scones. "It is a terribly busy day. A man could catch his death." Mrs. Wellington sniffed, her sharp eyes darting over his uniform. "Someone already has Hamish Macbeth. The entire village knows about the terrible business down at the wall. And here you are, looking for a handout while that loudmouth detective from Strathbane terrorizes the gulls." DCI Blair has the situation well in hand," Hamish lied smoothly, offering his most charming vacuous smile. He reached out and casually liberated a warm scone from the tray, taking a generous bite and savouring the melted butter. "He's currently convinced that old Angus MacDonald hauled the poor Sassenach up the crane for his wallet. I've been sent to fetch him, but I thought it best to let Angus finish his porridge first." Mrs. Kennedy gasped, clutching her pearls. "Angus? The man can barely lift his teapot. That Strathbane detective has a head full of wet peat." "Aye, it's a tragic lack of local knowledge," Hamish agreed, chewing thoughtfully. He leaned against the counter, projecting an aura of complete harmlessness. Mr. Thorne was a loud man, certainly. Made a lot of enemies in a very short time. But hoisting a man up a crane with a fisherman's knot takes a specific sort of grievance and strength. "Did Mr. Thorne upset anyone particularly badly yesterday?" The women exchanged a loaded glance, the universal currency of Highland villages. Mrs. Wellington leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "It wasn't just his complaints about the smell of the boats, Hamish. The man was a menace. Yesterday afternoon, he was down by the old curing sheds. He was talking to that slimy property developer from Inverness, the one who wants to turn the shoreline into luxury holiday pods." Hamish paused mid-chew, his sharp mind immediately cataloguing this new piece of information. "Holiday pods, you say? The ones that would block the access path for the fishing boats?" "Exactly," Mrs. Kennedy chimed in, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "Thorne was trying to buy the access rights. Claimed he was doing the village a favour by bringing in high-end tourism. I heard him shouting at someone behind the sheds around 4 o'clock. He was furious." "Did you happen to see who he was shouting at?" Hamish asked mildly, brushing a stray crumb from his tunic. "No," Mrs. Kennedy admitted, looking disappointed. "But I did hear a terrible splash, and then Thorne came storming up the high street cursing about his ruined clothes. He was missing one of his expensive Italian loafers, Hamish. Said some Highland savage had thrown it straight into the bloody loch during the argument." Hamish's blue eyes gleamed, though he kept his expression perfectly dull. A missing shoe before the murder occurred. It hadn't been taken by the killer. As a trophy it had been lost in a prior altercation, which meant the scene at the crane was staged to look like a spontaneous mugging, hiding a much deeper, premeditated motive. The tangled net and the fisherman's knot were misdirected. "Well, that is a shame about his shoe," Hamish sighed, finishing the last of his scone and dusting his hands together. "They looked very expensive. I suppose I had better go and inform old Angus of his impending arrest. It wouldn't do to keep DCI Blair waiting too long, lest his blood pressure finally gets the better of him." He touched his brow in a lazy salute to the ladies, whistled for lugs, and stepped back out into the freezing sunshine. The puzzle was slowly taking shape in his mind, and it had absolutely nothing to do with stolen wallets. The freezing Highland air bit at Hamish's ears as he navigated the slushy path leading toward the more affluent side of the loch. While DCI Blair was likely currently purple-faced and screaming at a confused octogenarian in a drafty cottage, Hamish found his thoughts drifting toward a different source of information. The mention of luxury holiday pods and property developers suggested a level of social manoeuvring that usually bypassed the local pub and ended up in the refined drawing rooms of the gentry. Specifically, it sounded like the sort of gossip that would eventually find its way to the ears of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. The Tommel Castle estate stood tall against the backdrop of the rugged, snow-capped peaks, its grey stone looking particularly austere in the winter light. Hamish felt the usual twinge of inadequacy as he approached the grand entrance, tugging at his ill-fitting tunic. He was a man who preferred a peat fire and stew pot to the rigid formalities of the castle, but Priscilla was different. She was his link to a world of manners and hidden agendas that he, for all his local cunning, sometimes struggled to decipher. As if summoned by his thoughts, Priscilla appeared on the gravel drive, looking effortlessly elegant in a quilted barber jacket and well-cut moleskin trousers. She was accompanied by Elspeth Grant, the local journalist whose sharp mind and even sharper tongue had often been a thorn in the side of the Strathbane Police Department. The two women stopped as they saw the lanky constable and his scruffy dog approaching. "Hamish!" Priscilla said, her voice like a cool stream. "We heard the sirens. I take it the news from the harbour is as grim as the village grapevine suggests?" "It's a messy business, Priscilla," Hamish replied, his Highland drawl thick and slow. "Mr. Thorne has been found in a state that no gentleman would care to be seen in, suspended from a crane like a side of beef." Elspeth crossed her arms, her eyes flashing with professional interest. "I hear Blair is already looking for a local scapegoat. He's been seen heading toward Angus MacDonald's croft. It's a disgrace, Hamish. The man can barely walk, let alone winch a body. The DCI, is a man of great speed and very little direction." Hamish agreed mildly. "But I was wondering if either of you had heard anything about Thorne's recent business dealings. Specifically, a certain interest in holiday pods and the shoreline access." Priscilla's expression tightened. "He was here for dinner only 2 nights ago, Hamish. My father was quite taken with the idea Thorne promised it would increase the estate's land value significantly. But there was a guest, a Mr. Henderson, who was quite vocal in his opposition. He's a keen environmentalist, or so he claims, but the argument became quite heated. Thorne mocked him, calling him a small-town obstructionist with no vision. And did this Henderson fellow happen to mention anything about Thorne's missing shoe?" Hamish asked, watching their faces closely. Elspeth let out a short, sharp laugh. "So that's what splashing was. We were walking near the curing sheds yesterday and saw Thorne stomping away, soaking wet and swearing. But Hamish, you're looking at it the wrong way. It wasn't just the pods. Thorne was bragging about a secret partner head found within the Villa Gesimione who was going to help him bypass the local council entirely." Hamish felt a prickle of interest at the back of his neck. A secret partner. In a village like Lochdub, a secret was a rare and precious commodity, usually guarded with more ferocity than a golden eagle's nest. If Thorne had been double-crossing the very people he was supposedly working with, or if his partner had realized Thorne was more liability than asset, the motive for murder became much clearer than a simple territorial dispute. "A partner, you say?" Hamish mused, scratching lugs behind the ears. "That's a very interesting piece of the puzzle. Did he happen to give a name?" "No," Priscilla shook her head. "But he did mention that this person knew the old ways of the village. It seemed like a strange thing for a Londoner to say. The old ways." The phrase sat heavy in the cold air. It brought Hamish's mind back to the fisherman's note and knot that looked authentic but was perhaps a little too perfect, as if someone was playing a part. He realized then that he had been looking for a disgruntled local, but he should have been looking for someone who was pretending to be one. "Thank you, ladies," Hamish said, tipping his cap. "You've given me much to think about. I'd best be getting back before Blair decides to arrest the entire parish council for lack of a better idea." As he turned to leave, Elspeth shouted, "Hamish! Watch your back. If someone is clever enough to frame old Angus, they're clever enough to see you coming." Hamish did not turn, but his pace quickened. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long skeletal shadows across the loch. The mystery was no longer just about a dead Sassenach. It was about a betrayal hidden deep in the heart of Lochdub. Hamish walked away from the grand shadows of Tommel Castle, his mind whirring beneath his shock of red hair like a well-oiled clock. The old ways were a dangerous thing to imitate in a place like Lochdub, where every man knew his neighbour's signature on a fishing net and he knew his own reflection. He whistled for Lugs, who was currently preoccupied with a frozen rabbit hole, and set a course back toward the village centre. The sky was beginning to bruise with shades of violet and deep indigo, the kind of winter evening that felt as though the very air might crack if you spoke too loudly. As he reached the outskirts of the village, the familiar, discordant sound of DCI Blair's voice drifted over a garden hedge. Hamish slowed his pace, peering through a gap in the hawthorn. There stood Blair, his face now a shade of purple that matched the sunset, looming over a trembling Angus MacDonald. The old man was perched on a stool outside his cottage, his gnarled hands clutching a mug of tea as if it were a holy relic. Detective Anderson stood behind Blair, looking profoundly embarrassed and holding a pair of handcuffs with a lack of conviction that was almost touching. "Don't lie to me, you ancient relic!" Blair roared, his breath blooming in the air like a dragon's. "We found the winch. We found the net. And everyone in this godforsaken hole says you're the best with a knot. You hated Thorn. He wanted your land for his fancy pods, and you decided to hang him out to dry. Literally. I tell ye, man, Angus wheezed, his voice thin and reedy. I haven't the strength to haul a bucket of water from the well, let alone a grown man. And that knot, it wasn't a mine. It was a slip knot variant used by the men over in Drim. Any fool could see that. A likely story. Blair snapped. Macbeth! There you are, skulking like a ginger ghost. Get over here and help me get this criminal to the car. We've found the motive and the means. Hamish stepped forward, his expression carefully blank, the very picture of a man who had never had a complex thought in his life. Ah, sir, I see you've been busy. But there's a small matter of a shoe. Did you find the missing loafer in Angus Cottage? Blair blinked, his eyes bulging. A shoe? What the devil are you talking about, Macbeth? The man was robbed. The shoe probably fell in the loch during the struggle. Well, that's just it, sir, Hamish said, scratching his chin with a slow, rhythmic motion. I was just speaking with the ladies up at the castle. It seems Mr. Thorn lost that shoe yesterday afternoon during a row by the curing sheds, long before he was hoisted up that crane. If the killer was a simple robber, why would he stage a scene that included a detail from an argument that happened hours earlier? And if it was Angus here, why would he use a drum fisherman's knot? It's almost as if someone wanted us to think it was a local, but didn't quite get the local details right. Blair's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. He hated being corrected, especially by Hamish, and especially when Hamish was making an annoying amount of sense. It's a red herring. Blair finally exploded. The shoe is irrelevant. The knot is a coincidence. I am arresting him. Of course, sir, Hamish replied mildly, stepping back with a shrug. Though I did notice that the winch handle had a bit of blue paint on it. A very specific shade of blue, like the paint used on the new shutters at the old manse. It's odd, isn't it? Mr. Thorn didn't have blue paint on his hands when he was at the hotel earlier. Anderson leaned in, looking interested. Blue paint, you say? Like a transfer from someone's gloves? Enough, Blair screamed, though he looked momentarily uncertain. Macnab, stay here, old man. Anderson, come with me. We're going to the old manse to see if this Thorn fellow had any associates who might have been decorating. Macbeth, stay out of my sight. If I see that dog near my tyres again, he'll have you both in the cells by morning. Hamish watched them roar in a cloud of exhaust and gravel. He didn't follow. He knew the old manse would be empty. The secret partner Elspeth mentioned wouldn't be sitting there waiting for the police. Instead, he turned his attention to a small, unassuming figure standing in the shadows of the post office across the street. It was Arthur Henderson, the environmentalist Priscilla had mentioned. He was wearing a sturdy blue parka, the exact shade of the shutters at the manse, and he was watching the police car disappear with an expression of intense, quiet relief. Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the Highland wind. The obvious suspect was being cleared, the incompetent boss was chasing ghosts, and the real player was hiding in plain sight, protected by a coat that matched a crime scene. It was time for Hamish to do what he did best, stop acting like a policeman and start acting like a neighbour who simply wanted a quiet chat over a very long, very revealing walk. He whistled for lugs, and the two of them began to shadow Henderson through the darkening streets of Lochdub. The violet twilight of Lochdub had deepened into a bruised, heavy blackness as Hamish Macbeth trailed Arthur Henderson. The environmentalist moved with a nervous, jerky energy, his blue parka a ghostly blur against the ancient stone walls and frozen hedgerows. Hamish kept back, his soft-soled boots making no sound on the icy macadam, while Lugs trotted beside him with a discipline that the dog usually reserved only for the prospect of a mutton bone. They skirted the edge of the village, moving toward the derelict curing sheds, where the previous day's altercation had supposedly taken place. Henderson wasn't heading home, he was returning to the scene of the struggle, and Hamish felt the familiar, cold prickle of intuition at the base of his neck. The air grew thicker with the scent of brine and rotting kelp as they approached the water's edge. Henderson stopped by a cluster of rusted iron drums, looking around furtively before leaning over the low sea wall. He seemed to be searching for something in the dark, swirling water below. Hamish stepped out from the shadow of a salt-stained shed, his voice low and conversational, slicing through the rhythmic slap of the tide. It's a bit late for beachcombing, is it not, Mr. Henderson? The tide is coming in, and the water in the loch is cold enough to stop a man's heart in minutes. Henderson jumped so violently he nearly toppled over the wall, his face ghostly pale in the moonlight. Macbeth! You startled me. I was just taking in the night air. It's been a stressful day with all the police activity, and that dreadful man's death. He tried to affect an air of righteous indignation, but his hands were buried deep in the pockets of that blue parka, and they were shaking visibly. "Aye, it's been a trial for us all," Hamish said, strolling closer until he was lean and towering over the smaller man. "Especially for poor Angus MacDonald. DCI Blair is quite convinced the old man is a cold-blooded killer, but I keep thinking about that secret partner Thorne was bragging about. A partner who knew the old ways. Now, a man like Thorne, he didn't care about the environment or the heritage of Lochstub. He only cared about the profit. But a partner. Co-partner might have a different motive entirely." Henderson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I don't know what you're talking about. I opposed Thorne's developments on principle. Everyone knows that." "That's just it," Hamish drawled, his Highland accent becoming even more pronounced, a sure sign his mind was moving at double speed. "You opposed him publicly. It made you the perfect cover. If Thorne's holiday pods were built, the property value of the surrounding shoreline would skyrocket. And I believe you own a significant stretch of that shoreline through a numbered company in Edinburgh, don't you?" Priscilla mentioned Thorne had a partner who was going to help him bypass the council. Who better than the man leading the protest? You'd have the inside track on every legal challenge. The silence that followed was broken only by the mournful cry of a distant gull. Henderson's eyes darted toward the water again. Hamish sighed, a long, misty breath in the freezing air. But Thorne was greedy, wasn't he? He realized he didn't need a partner once the initial hurdles were cleared. He was going to cut you. That row yesterday by the sheds. It wasn't about environmentalism. It was about a contract. He laughed at you, didn't he? Called you a small-town obstructionist. And in the scuffle, his shoe went into the water. He was a monster, Henderson hissed, the mask of the mild-mannered activist finally cracking to reveal a jagged, desperate ego. He was going to ruin everything. I put my life savings into those land options. He was going to leave me with nothing but a view of his garish pods. "So you decided to make it look like a local grudge," Hamish said sadly. "You knew about the Drim fisherman's knot, probably saw it in a book or a museum display. You thought you were being clever, staging a Highland execution to point the finger at a savage. You even used your blue-painted shutters to help hoist him, not realizing You'd left a trace on the winch." Henderson retreated, his heels clicking the ice stone. "You can't prove any of this, Macbeth. Blair thinks it's Angus. By the time he realizes he's wrong, he'll be gone. You're just a lazy village copper who spends his time poaching salmon. Nobody listens to you." "You're right," Hamish agreed with a deceptive smile. "Nobody listens to me, but they do listen to rumours. And I've started a very interesting one about a certain blue parka and a missing shoe that's currently caught in the reeds just 20 yards from where you're standing. If you're as smart as you think you are, you'll realise the trap is already closing." Hamish whistled for lugs and turned his back, knowing that the vanity of a man like Henderson would soon lead him to a very public mistake. Hamish did not look back as he walked away, his tall, thin frame blending into the lengthening shadows of the curing sheds. He knew Henderson was watching him, caught between the urge to flee and the desperate need to retrieve the evidence that could hang him. The mention of the shoe caught in the reeds was a complete fabrication, a piece of fly fishing for the soul that Hamish had perfected over years of dealing with the self-important. There was no shoe in the reeds if it hadn't been swept out to sea by the turning tide. It was likely buried deep in the silt of the loch floor. But a man like Henderson, possessed by the frantic arrogance of the amateur criminal, wouldn't be able to ignore the possibility that his perfect crime was unravelling because of a single stray loafer. "Come along, lugs," Hamish murmured, the dog's claws clicking rhythmically on the frozen ground. "We have a bit of theatre to arrange." He did not return to the police station. Instead, he made his way to the back of the Lochstub Hotel, slipping through the kitchen entrance where the smell of roasting lamb and old dishwater hung heavy in the air. He found Nellie, the cook, busy scrubbing a massive iron pot. She looked up, her face red from the heat of the stove. "Hamish Macbeth, if you're looking for scraps, you're too late. The Strathbane police have eaten us out of house and home," complaining all the while. Nellie grumbled, though her eyes softened as she tossed a small piece of suet to Lugs. "I am not after food, Nellie, though a bit of that lamb wouldn't go amiss later," Hamish said with a wink. "I need you to do me a favour. It's for the benefit of the village. I need you to spread a word to Mrs. Kennedy and the rest of the girls. Tell them that the stupid policeman, that's me, mind found a vital clue by the old pier. Tell them I'm going down there at 10 o'clock tonight with a torch to fish out a piece of evidence that will sink the real killer. Make sure you mention the blue parka." Nellie paused, her eyes widening. The blue parka. You mean Arthur Henderson's coat? Surely he didn't just tell them, Nellie, Hamish interrupted gently, and tell them to stay away. It's going to be a very private affair. By 9:30, the mist had rolled in from the Atlantic, thick and white as wool, swallowing the lights of the village and turning the loch into a void of muffled sounds. Hamish sat on an old upturned boat near the pier, his torch switched off, wrapped in his heaviest greatcoat. Lugs were tucked under his arm for warmth. The cold was absolute, the kind that seemed to seep through bone and marrow, but Hamish remained perfectly still. He was a master of waiting. It was a skill he had honed during long nights on the moors, waiting for poachers, and it served him well now. He knew DCI Blair was likely back at the station, basking in the glow of his own supposed brilliance, while poor Angus MacDonald sat in a cold cell. Blair would be dreaming of the commendation he would receive for cracking the Highland murder. The thought gave Hamish a twinge of guilt for the old man, but he knew the only way to free Angus was to catch the real predator in the act of protecting his lies. A faint sound broke the silence-eth crunch of a boot on a loose pebble. Hamish tensed, his hand resting on Lug's collar to keep the dog quiet. Through the swirling fog, a figure appeared, a dark shape against the paler grey of the water. It was Henderson. He was no longer wearing the blue parka he had changed into a dark, inconspicuous raincoat, but his movements were unmistakable. He was carrying a long-handled gaff, the kind used for landing large fish, and he was heading straight for the patch of reeds where Hamish had claimed the shoe was hidden. Henderson reached the water's edge and began to poke frantically at the reeds, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps that Hamish could hear even from 20 yards away. The man was whispering to himself, a frantic litany of curses and prayers. He was so focused on the imaginary shoe that he didn't hear Hamish stand up. "It's a bit deep there for wading, Mr. Henderson," Hamish said, his voice ringing out clearly through the fog. "And I am afraid the evidence is exactly where I put Ita in your own head." Henderson spun around, the gaff raised like a spear, his face twisted in a mask of pure murderous panic. The trap had been snapped shut, but the cornered animal was about to prove far more dangerous than the bumbling academic Hamish had first encountered. The Highland night was about to get very messy indeed. The mist clung to the pier like a damp shroud, distorting the world into a series of jagged grey silhouettes. Arthur Henderson stood at the water's edge, the long iron gaff trembling in his hands. His eyes, usually hidden behind the placid lenses of a man concerned with bird migrations and peat bog preservation, were wide and gleaming with a frantic, cornered light. The realization that he had been tricked, that there was no shoe, only the echo of his own guilt reflected back at him by a stupid village, Constable seemed to snap the last chord of his composure. He looked less like a scholar and more like a feral creature caught in the glare of a hunter's lamp. "You think you're so clever, Macbeth," Henderson hissed, his voice cracking against the rhythmic slap of the loch. "You sit in your little cottage, poaching and loafing, while the rest of us actually try to build something, to protect something." Thorn was a parasite. He was going to sell the soul of this village to the highest bidder. "I did what had to be done. I saved Lochdub from him. Saving a village by hanging a man from a crane is a strange sort of charity, Arthur," Hamish replied. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hands held out at his sides, palms open. He looked relaxed, almost bored, but his muscles were coiled under his greatcoat. Lugs had moved to the flank, a low, guttural growl vibrating in the dog's chest that sounded like shifting gravel. And framing old Angus? A man who's lived here his whole life without harm to a soul. That's not protection, that's just cowardice. The word cowardice seemed to strike Henderson like a physical blow. With a strangled cry, he lunged. He didn't swing the gaff, he thrust it forward like a bayonet, the rusted iron hook aiming for Hamish's chest. For a man of his slight build, the desperation of the moment lent him a terrifying, manic strength. Hamish moved with the deceptive grace of a Highland wildcat. He didn't jump back, he pivoted on the ball of his foot, letting the iron point whistle past his ribs. As Henderson's momentum carried him forward, Hamish reached out and gripped the wooden shaft of the gaff, twisting it sharply. The two men grappled in the freezing mud, their breath coming in white plumes that mingled with the fog. Henderson clawed at Hamish's face, his fingernails catching the constable's cheek, but Hamish didn't flinch. He used his height to leverage Henderson downward, pressing the smaller man into the slushy reeds. Lugs saw his opening. The mongrel didn't go for a throat or a limb. He darted in and sank his teeth firmly into the seat of Henderson's trousers, pulling backward with all the weight of a determined anchor. The sudden, undignified pain caused Henderson to yelp and lose his grip on the gaff. Hamish seized the moment, sweeping Henderson's legs out from under him and pinning him to the ground. "That's enough, Arthur," Hamish panted, his chest heaving as he sat heavily on the man's back. "The game is over. You've got mud on your face and a dog on your backside. There's no dignity left in this for either of us." Henderson struggled for a moment longer, his face pressed into the freezing muck of the shoreline, before the fight finally drained out of him. He went limp, a sob breaking from his throat. The arrogance of the secret partner had vanished, replaced by the hollow reality of a man who had murdered for a patch of coastline and ended up with nothing but a ruined reputation and a prison cell. Hamish reached into his pocket and produced a pair of heavy iron handcuffs. They were old and cold to the touch, but they clicked shut with a finality that seemed to echo across the water. He pulled Henderson to his feet, the man now shivering uncontrollably in the midnight air. "Why?" Henderson whispered, his voice broken. "Why did you care? You hated Thorn too." "I did," Hamish said, wiping a smear of blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. "But I prefer the truth, and I like my sleep. I wouldn't have had much of either with Angus sitting in a cell for your handiwork." He began the long walk back toward the village, leading his prisoner through the mist. The lights of the lodged-up hotel flickered in the distance, a beacon of warmth that felt 1,000 miles away. Hamish knew the hard part was over, but a different kind of challenge awaited him. He had a murderer, he had the motive, and he had the evidence of the attempt to hide the shoe. Now, he just had to figure out how to give the whole mess to DCI Blair without accidentally getting himself promoted. The walk back to the village police station was a somber, silent procession through the shifting curtains of Highland mist. Hamish marched Henderson along the narrow track, the man's head bowed in a mixture of exhaustion and utter defeat. Lugs trotted behind them, his tail held high with the pride of a dog who had recently tasted the seat of an environmentalist's trousers and found the experience quite satisfying. As they approached the small stone building that served as both Hamish's home and his office, the glare of several sets of headlights cut through the fog. DCI Blair's team was preparing to transport old Angus MacDonald to the holding cells in Strathbane, a move that would have been a catastrophic stain on the village's peace. Hamish stopped at the edge of the light, letting the dramatic scene unfold for a moment. Blair was standing by the open door of a police van, his face illuminated by a flashlight, looking like a particularly irritable demon. He was shouting at Detective Anderson about the lack of proper paperwork for a midnight transfer. When he spotted Hamish emerging from the darkness leading a handcuffed, mud-caked Arthur Henderson, Blair's jaw dropped so low it appeared he might lose his dentures to the gravel. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, storming forward with a gait that suggested he was about to explode. "What is the meaning of this?" "I told you to stay out of my sight. Who is this tramp, and why have you got my handcuffs on him?" Hamish stopped, offering a look of profound, wide-eyed innocence that he had practiced in front of his shaving mirror for years. He let his shoulders slump and adopted an even slower, more hesitant drawl. "Oh, hello, sir. I'm terribly sorry to bother you when you're so busy with the big arrest. It's just... well, I found Mr. Henderson down by the pier. He was acting very strangely, trying to fish something out of the lock with a gaff. He seemed quite upset, sir. Kept babbling about how Head framed poor Angus because he couldn't stand the thought of those holiday pods." Blair squinted at Henderson, who was currently shivering and staring at the ground. "Framed him? Don't be ridiculous. I've already solved this case. Angus MacDonald had the motive and the knots." "Aye, that's what I thought too, sir," Hamish said, nodding vigorously like a man eager to agree with his superior. "But then Mr. Henderson here started showing me where Head hidden the blue parka that matches the paint on the winch. And he told me all about his secret business partnership with Thorn. It seems he was the one who tied that drum knot, thinking it would lead a brilliant detective, like yourself, right to the local fisherman. He was trying to outsmart you, sir. A terrible insult to a man of your experience." Blair's ears turned a vivid shade of crimson. The idea that someone had attempted to outsmart him was far more offensive than the murder itself. He approached Henderson, looming over him. "Is this true? You thought you could lead the Strathbane CID on a wild goose chase by playing at being a Highlander?" Henderson looked up, his eyes hollow. He was going to take everything, he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The land, the profit. I did the work, and he was going to discard me." Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound. "It's a real shame, sir. I suppose I should have called you sooner, but I didn't want to interrupt your important work with Angus. If you want, I can take Mr. Henderson into the back and start the paperwork, and you can tell the chief constable how you managed to smoke out the real killer by putting pressure on the village until the partner cracked and revealed himself." Blair paused. The gears of his ambition were turning visibly behind his small, piggy eyes. If he arrested Henderson now, he could claim that the arrest of Angus had been a brilliant tactical feint designed to flush out the real culprit. It would look like a masterpiece of psychological warfare rather than a bumbling mistake. He looked at Hamish, suspicious as always, but the constable just looked tired and slightly dim-witted. A feint, Blair muttered, smoothing his coat. Yes, exactly. I knew the local was too old to act alone. I wanted to see who would panic first. And it worked. Anderson, get this man in the van. Release the old fool MacDonald, tell him he's lucky I am in a merciful mood. And Macbeth, give me your notes. I'll be the one writing the final report on this sting operation. Hamish handed over a crumpled piece of paper with a few scrawled lines. Of course, sir. It's all you're doing. I was just the boots on the ground. I'm sure the papers will be very impressed with your Highland strategy. As the police cars roared away toward the main road, leaving Lochdub in silence once more, Hamish stood in the middle of the street. He had avoided the promotion, saved Angus, and ensured the real killer was caught, all while making Blair feel like a genius. It was a perfect result. He turned toward his cottage, thinking of the cold salmon sitting in his kitchen and the warmth of his peat fire. The village's peace was restored, even if the price was letting a man like Blair take the credit. The following morning, the sun broke through the Highland mist with a rare, golden clarity that made the waters of the loch sparkle like spilled diamonds. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the comforting scent of peat smoke and frying bacon. Hamish Macbeth stood over his small stove, expertly flipping a thick slice of black pudding while Luggs sat at his feet, his nose twitching in a rhythmic dance of anticipation. The chaos of the previous night's sirens, the shouting, and the purple-faced fury of DCI Blair already felt like a distant, unpleasant dream. A soft knock at the door preceded the arrival of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She looked radiant in a cream-coloured wool sweater, though her expression was one of quiet amusement. She carried a small basket covered in linen. "I hear the village is safe once more, Hamish," she said, stepping into the warmth of the kitchen. "And I hear from the post office that DCI Blair is currently being hailed in the Strathbane papers as a master of psychological profiling for his brilliant trap involving Angus MacDonald." Hamish chuckled, sliding a plate of breakfast onto the wooden table. "Aye, the DCI is a very talented man, Priscilla. It takes a special kind of genius to be so wrong that you eventually come out the other side of being right. As long as he stays in Strathbane and leaves us to our peace, he can call himself the King of Scotland for all I care." Priscilla set her basket on the counter. "My father sent these, a few bottles of his best claret and some venison steaks. He's relieved that the business of the holiday pods has been buried along with Mr. Thorne's ambitions. It seems the Crown Office has frozen the secret partner's land options. That is very kind of the Colonel," Hamish said, his eyes gleaming at the prospect of the venison. He sat down, pouring a mug of tea that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. Lochdub isn't a place for holiday pods and Italian cars. It's a place for things that take time to grow and even longer to change. They sat in a companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the occasional happy grunt from Luggs as he received a morsel of bacon. The mystery was solved, the outsider was gone, and the village's delicate balance had been restored. Through the window, Hamish could see old Angus MacDonald limping toward the pier, his pipe firmly clenched in his teeth, looking none the worse for his brief stint as a suspected murderer. "You really don't mind, do you?" Priscilla asked softly, watching him. "Letting Blair take all the credit for your work. You could have been a sergeant now, Hamish. You could have your own department in a city." Hamish looked around his small, cluttered kitchen, chipped mugs, the soot-stained hearth, the dog sleeping on his boots, and the vast, untamed mountains looming outside his door. He thought of the grey pavements of Glasgow and the endless paperwork of a promotion. A slow, contented smile spread across his face, reaching his sharp blue eyes. "And give up all this, Priscilla. I am a lazy man, remember, and it takes a terrible amount of effort to be a sergeant. Besides," he added, taking a long, satisfying sip of his tea, "someone has to keep an eye on the salmon in the loch. It's a full-time job ensuring they don't get lonely." As Priscilla laughed and prepared to leave, Hamish felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The stupid village policeman had won again. He had protected his neighbours, satisfied the law, and, most importantly, secured his right to remain exactly where he was. When the door closed, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, drifting into a light doze. The drizzle began to tap gently against the window pane once more, returning the Highlands to their natural misty state. Lochdub was quiet, the air was cool, and for Hamish Macbeth, life was exactly as it should be.